last time we were talking about Mackey's argument from Evil, and Mackey's argument relied on the premise that a perfectly good being would eliminate every evil that it can. And the thought there was, well, by definition, if something is good or loving, then of course, if it encounters some evil it can get rid of, it will. The trouble was, as we saw, that that claim is susceptible to some obvious counterexamples. We had the perfectly good doctor case, but more generally, the point is that a good being might not eliminate an evil that it can't eliminate without causing more evil or eliminating an equal or greater good. In fact, if a being is truly good, presumably its goodness would lead it to not eliminate certain evils, namely those evils that it knows it can't get rid of without doing more damage to the world. So, really, the principle that atheists and Mackey in particular, who are relying on these sorts of arguments as proofs against God's existence, the principle they needed was not that a perfectly good being eliminates every single evil, because that's false, but rather that a perfectly good being eliminates every evil that it can eliminate without doing further damage. That's kind of the abbreviated way of putting this larger claim, or this longer, more detailed claim, that a perfectly good being eliminates every evil it can without either causing more evil or eliminating an equal or greater good. Let's just compress that and put it this way. A perfectly good being will certainly get rid of every evil that it can eliminate without doing further damage to the world. Those are the ones that a perfectly good being will get rid of. The trouble is that what we now need to do, if we're going to run with this revised principle and revise what Mackey was earlier calling his quasi-logical rule, or his bridge principle, we have to slot this principle, this revised version of it, back into the argument. And if we do that, the rest of the argument no longer follows. We no longer have a valid argument. Remember that each of the subsequent steps of Mackey's argument from Evil relied in part on the first assumption. So if we change the first principle, subsequent steps no longer follow. Now, this doesn't mean that the argument from Evil is done for. Rather, what it means is that a stronger version of the argument from Evil that takes into account the revision of premise 1 will need to also include revisions at other steps in the argument to preserve its validity. So, for example, if we have as our first premise the revised bridge principle, a perfectly good being eliminates every evil it can eliminate without doing further damage. And we keep our second step, which is if God exists, then God is perfectly good. What now follows is not that, therefore, if God exists, then God eliminates every evil God can, but rather, God will, if God exists, eliminate a subset of evils that God can eliminate, namely those that God can eliminate without doing further damage. That's all that follows from 1 and 2 now. So our third step, we're going to have to revise as well. Therefore, if God exists, then God eliminates every evil that God can eliminate without doing further damage. When we move to the fourth step of the argument, previously in Mackey's original version, we just had an omnipotent being can eliminate every evil. We're going to have to revise that as well now in order to preserve the validity of the argument. What we now need to say is an omnipotent being can eliminate every evil that can be eliminated without doing further damage. So what this is telling us is an omnipotent being can eliminate every single evil of a certain sort, namely those evils that can be eliminated without doing further damage. When we pair that with the fifth step, which we're going to keep the same, if God exists, then God is omnipotent, what now follows is not that if God exists, then God can eliminate every evil, full stop. Instead, all that follows from 4 and 5 is, therefore, if God exists, then God can eliminate every evil that can be eliminated without doing further damage. Now, it may also be true that if God exists, God can eliminate every single evil, but all that follows from 4 and 5 is that if God exists, God can eliminate every evil that can be eliminated without doing further damage. This leaves open the possibility, hey, maybe there's some evils that can't be eliminated without doing further damage. When we turn to 7, recall that earlier in the earlier version, 7 said, if God exists, then God does eliminate every evil. And that followed crucially from 3 and 6. But now we've changed 3 and 6. And so the claim that if God exists, then God eliminates every single evil no longer straightforwardly follows from 3 and 6. What does follow is a more limited claim, which is therefore if God exists, then God eliminates every evil that can be eliminated without doing further damage. That is, if God exists, then God will certainly get rid of all the evils that can be eliminated without either causing more evil in the process or eliminating an equal or greater good. When we get down to step 8, which was before just what we called C, if God exists, then there's no evil, 8 is supposed to follow from 7. And what 7 now says is, therefore, if God exists, then God eliminates every evil that can be eliminated without doing further damage. It doesn't therefore follow that if God exists, there's no evil at all. Rather, what follows is that if God exists, there's no evil of a certain sort. Namely, that there's no evil that can be eliminated without doing further damage. And that's a significant and substantial change to the argument. So what we're doing here is, in order to preserve the validity of the argument, we're making these what might seem like minor changes to the wording. But when we get down to step 8, we can now see that this is actually substantively changing the claims being made. Because before 8 said that if God exists, then there should be no evil at all. Now 8 says, if God exists, then there's no evil of a particular kind. There's no unnecessary evil. There's no unjustifiable evil. There's no gratuitous evil. Or the way we'll put it, there's no evil that can be eliminated without doing further damage to the world. Now, once we've changed 8, the ultimate conclusion to this argument at 10 is supposed to be God does not exist. And if we keep step 9 as just, hey, there's evil, then 10 doesn't validly follow anymore. Because 8 says if God exists, then there's no evil that can be eliminated without doing further damage. 8 doesn't say if God exists, then there's no evil at all. 8 says God's existence and the existence of evil are perfectly consistent. What's inconsistent with God's existence is the existence of evil of a particular kind, namely unnecessary evil. So we now need to change 9 if we're going to have a valid argument to say not just, hey, there's some evil, to instead the claim, there is evil that can be eliminated without doing further damage. There's a specific sort of evil. And that sort of evil, according to the revised argument from evil, is the sort of evil that proves that God does not exist. Because if there were such a being, God would certainly get rid of those evils that can be eliminated without doing further damage. What we've now done is taken the original argument from evil. We had to change its first premise, and then we had to go ahead and change each of the subsequent steps in certain ways in order to preserve the validity of the inferences being made. In doing so, what we really did was also change the locus of controversy. So before, step 1 of the original argument from evil was the one that seemed controversial or open to counterexample, whereas step 9 that just said, hey, there's evil, was like, well, yeah, of course. Have you ever stubbed your toe? If so, then there's evil. What we now have in our revised argument from evil, though, is a reversal. Now, our first premise is much stronger and not susceptible to perfectly good doctor-style counterexamples. A perfectly good being does eliminate every evil that it can eliminate without doing further damage. Certainly, that is true. But now, what we have at 9 is something much more controversial. What we have at 9 is the claim there's evil of a particular variety. Namely, there's evil that can be eliminated without doing further damage. There's gratuitous, unnecessary, unjustifiable evil. And the theist at this point can begin to say, wait a second, I agree that there's suffering, but I don't know why I should agree that there's suffering that could be eliminated from the world without doing further damage. Maybe all the suffering or evil there is such that if you get rid of it, you're going to do damage to the world. So why should I agree to this new claim that there's gratuitous evil? I don't know, maybe not. Maybe it's all serving some purpose I don't know about. What this does is this means that the atheist now has to mount a defense of premise 9. Previously, premise 9 just was uncontroversial, no one should deny it. And now, if you're an atheist or a defender of this argument, you need to give the theist a reason to believe that there's evil that can be gotten rid of without doing further damage to the world. The burden of proof has shifted, in other words. And the atheist now bears a burden of proof that they didn't bear before when they were trying to defend the first version of the argument. And when we look to J.L. Mackie, he, although he isn't exactly defending this version of the argument, he does say some things that I think you can read as a defense of the claim, not just that there's evil, but that there's evil of a particular variety, namely evil that can be eliminated without doing further damage. We're going to call this Mackie's omnipotence defense, because his defense of the claim that there are evils that can be eliminated without doing further damage draws on the notion of omnipotence itself. Okay, here's the first step of Mackie's reasoning. An omnipotent being can eliminate every evil without doing further damage. That's the first step. Now, what Mackie's saying here is, look, we should all agree that an omnipotent being can eliminate every evil. After all, an omnipotent being can do anything. That's just the definition of omnipotence. So, furthermore, we should also add, if it can do anything, then an omnipotent being can also eliminate every single evil there is without doing further damage. The perfectly good doctor may not be able to wave a magic wand and get rid of your paper cut without also doing more damage to your finger in the process. The perfectly good doctor might not be able to do that, but that's just because the perfectly good doctor is not all powerful. If the perfectly good doctor were all powerful, then she would be able to snap her fingers, get rid of the paper cut, and let you keep the finger as well. An omnipotent being could do that. And more generally, an omnipotent being could get rid of all evil while keeping all of the goods and not introducing more evil. I don't know how, but it's all powerful. It could figure out a way. This next step is the theistic claim that if God exists, then God is omnipotent. Where's this coming from? This is just part of classical theism. It follows from 1 and 2 that therefore, if God exists, then God can eliminate every evil without doing further damage. Because an omnipotent being can eliminate every evil without doing further damage, and if God exists, then God is omnipotent. Now we just need to add one more little step here, which is, hey, there is some evil. There is some suffering. Pick your paper cut or the stubbing of the toe or something horrible like the Holocaust, whatever your example of suffering is, we all agree that there is some suffering. And what we just saw was, if God exists, then God can eliminate every evil there is without doing further damage. And there is evil. So it follows that if God exists, then there is evil that can be eliminated without doing further damage. Which evils? Well, actually, all of them. All of the existing evils, from the biggest to the smallest, are evils that if there were a God, God would be able to eliminate without doing further damage. And so, if God exists, then there are evils that can be eliminated by God without doing further damage. God can take all of the evils away, keep all the goods, and not introduce any further evil into the world. Now notice that step 9.5 here is not quite equivalent to the ninth step of the revised argument from evil. That step said there is evil that can be eliminated without doing further damage. And 9.5 says if God exists, then there's evil that can be eliminated without doing further damage. And this might be a little puzzling because, wait a second, Mackie is not a theist, so why does he have this stuff about God in there? And I thought the atheist was supposed to give us reason to think that there is evil that can be eliminated without doing further damage. Keep in mind, though, that Mackie's target, the person he's talking to, does believe in God. And so if we look at this conditional, if God exists, then there is evil that can be eliminated without doing further damage, Mackie's going to be talking to a theist and say, hey, theist, what do you believe? The theist will say, I think God exists. And then Mackey will walk them through the omnipotence defense and get them to conclude, if God exists, then there's evil that can be eliminated without doing further damage. But I believe God exists. Therefore, I, theist, believe that God can eliminate evil, that there is evil that God can eliminate without doing further damage. Or in other words, there is some evil that can be eliminated without doing further damage. So that's why this bit about God is sitting there in the antecedent of step 9.5. A theist will look at 9.5, say, I believe in God. I also think that if God exists, then the evils that there are could be gotten rid of without doing further damage. Therefore, I should conclude that there are evils that can be eliminated without doing further damage. And then Mackey says, I've got you. That's step 9 of the revised argument from evil. So you should conclude that God does not exist. I'm just going to flag that another way of understanding Mackey's omnipotence defense is as running what's sometimes called a reductio ad absurdum argument. Because Mackey's also argued that if God exists, then there's no evil that can be eliminated without doing further damage. So if he's successful in defending that claim, and he's also convinced the theist that if God exists, then there's evil that can be eliminated without doing further damage, what he's just shown is that if God exists, then there both is and is not evil that can be eliminated without doing further damage, which is a contradiction. And so God does not exist. It's an alternative way of understanding what Mackey's up to. How can a theist reply to Mackey's omnipotence defense? Well, they definitely have to reject this conclusion that if God exists, then there's evil that can be eliminated without doing further damage. But if they reject that conclusion, then they had better reject one of the premises, because that conclusion followed validly from 1, 2, 3, and 4. When we work our way back up, it's hard to see initially which step they should reject. I mean, they shouldn't reject 4. Of course there's evil. And if they reject 3, it had better be because they reject either 1 or 2 or both, because 3 validly follows from 1 and 2. When we look at 2, what we have is if God exists and God is omnipotent. Now, this came up in our original version of the argument from evil. Mackey and other atheists are going to say, I mean, you could abandon the idea that God's omnipotent, but that would effectively be to abandon the existence of the God of classical theism, which to me, the non-believer is sort of just as good as you saying there is no God. So really the only place for the theist to press back here is on the claim that an omnipotent being can eliminate every evil without doing further damage. That's a little puzzling, though, because that seems to just follow from the definition of omnipotence. I mean, isn't omnipotence just the ability to do anything? And if it's just the ability to do anything, then it includes the ability to get rid of all suffering without doing more damage in the process. A being that couldn't do that wouldn't be all-powerful. At least that's the thought. I think that the theist has something to say here. And in laying out the theist's reasons for rejecting 9.1 or their objection to 9.1, hopefully we'll begin to see what the real nub of the disagreement between the theist and the atheist over evil comes to. So the way I think of it is that the theist's rejection of 9.1 proceeds in 3 steps. Here's step 1. The theist begins by saying, okay, look, there are some things that are not just good, but that are very good. And furthermore, these goods, by definition, require the existence of certain evils. Let me say that again. There are certain things that are very good, and their existence logically or conceptually requires the existence of certain evils. So these are what are known as higher order goods. This is what Mackey calls them. It's important to see that higher order goods are not just goods that causally require the existence of certain evils. So for example, if you're going to get really ripped, right? As a causal matter, you have to go to the gym and lift weights. But it's not part of the very definition of having big muscles that you've pumped iron. That's not the definition of having big muscles. Definition of having big muscles is just something about, I don't know, the biology and the physics and the shape of the muscles. That's the definition of the concept. Um, but the thought is some goods are even more closely linked to pain and suffering or evil than having big muscles is linked to the evil of suffering at the gym. So, for example, these are some candidate higher order goods. I invite you to think about whether these work or not. But one possibility is that something like courage might be a higher order good. It's a higher order good in the sense that the very definition of courage makes reference to the existence of something that we could construe as an evil. So it seems like the definition of being courageous is facing danger of a certain kind. And danger is the sort of thing that can cause pain. A world with no danger is a world with no courage, by definition. If you say that person was courageous but they didn't face any danger, there's something like incoherent about that idea. Likewise, generosity seems to require there, as a very definition of generosity, for there to be a need that the generous person is meeting. And need involves suffering of some kind. The most famous example or putative example of a higher order good is freedom of the will. And this is a famous example in the theist's response to arguments from evil. The theist typically will say one big piece of the story about why it is that a good God who's all powerful would allow for there to be so much suffering is that there are these great goods. Among them are acts of human agency or acts of human autonomy, the ability that we have to choose of our own free will between good and evil under no coercive pressure from the outside. That, so the theist claims, is a good and beautiful thing of almost limitless value. But unfortunately, of necessity, free will involves the possibility of some beings using their free will to make bad choices. And indeed, the claim is, by definition, if a being is free, then at least sometimes it makes choices that result in harm to itself and to others. So a higher order good that has been really important in the history of this argument is the very notion of freedom. Freedom is such a great good that God judged it better in the end that there should be free will, despite the fact that some would choose to use their freedom badly, as opposed to having no free creatures at all. Now, that's only part of the story. That's the theist's response to 9.1. The first step was, look, there are goods that are higher order goods, that are very good and that logically require some evil to exist. The second step is that the theist needs to clarify what omnipotence is. Recall that omnipotence, we initially just defined it as the ability to do anything. And that's right. That is the traditional definition. But I think when we look at 9.1, what it says is, hey, an omnipotent being, it can eliminate every evil without doing further damage. And the theist will say, well, let's be really careful here. When I say that omnipotence is the ability to do anything, I'm really emphasizing the thing, okay? Like, it has to be a coherent action of some sort. So here are some things that certainly an omnipotent being, if there is one, had better be able to do in order for it to count as genuinely all-powerful. Move a big desk, move a mountain, turn water into wine. I mean, violate the laws of nature, bring the dead back to life, create the universe from nothing. These are all things in the sense of these are all actions that a being needs to be able to perform if it's to count as all powerful. So they fall within the scope of anything. Here are some things that the theist will say anything does not encompass. Anything does not include lamp dog ponying, for example, or slithy toes gyring and gimbling in the wabe. Those first two, the reason that those are not in the scope of anything is that they're just nonsense. It's not like if somebody says, well, God can't lamp dog pony. They're not thereby ascribing a limitation to God, because lamp dog ponying is not a thing. It's just nonsense. It doesn't describe an action. Nor does slithy toes gyring and gimbling in the wabe. Famously, this is from Lewis Carroll's Jabberwocky. It's nonsense. It's supposed to be nonsense. Now, whenever I teach this, some people are like, some edgelords are like, well, can't we just let slithy toes gyring and gimbling in the wabe mean make a pony? And couldn't God make a pony? So therefore, couldn't God let slithy toes gyre and gimble in the wabe? And the answer to that is, if you're changing the meaning and giving a stipulative meaning to slithy toes gyring and gimbling in the wabe, then yes, but what you mean by that is just making a pony, which is a perfectly coherent thing and not a problem at all. On the other hand, if what you mean by slithy toes gyring and gimbling in the wabe is nonsense, which is what it's usually intended by, then no, God can't do that, but that doesn't count against God's omnipotence, because that's not a thing to be done. Other things that traditionally theologians and philosophers thinking about omnipotence have said is not in the scope of omnipotence are making square circles, making 2 + 2 = 5, making married bachelors. Another really important thing, if there are higher order goods that will be in this sort of category, will be eliminating danger without eliminating courage. Because recall that the very definition of courage includes or requires the existence of danger. And so to eliminate danger without eliminating courage would be akin to making 2 + 2 = 5, akin to making married bachelors. Likewise, eliminating need without also eliminating generosity would be akin to making married bachelors, because generosity by definition requires there to be need. More generally, eliminating any evil without also getting rid of the higher order goods that there are, according to the theist, is a contradiction, and so does not express a thought, an action, or a concept at all. It is like saying God can't lamp dog pony, which is not to say that God is in any way limited. So what we've just seen is that omnipotence means the ability to do anything, and we just need to be careful about what falls in the scope of anything. We need to emphasize, whether we're theists or not, the thing part. How do we tell the difference? Really broadly, I mean, this is a hard question, but really broadly, one way of distinguishing the items that fall in the scope of thing and those that don't fall in the scope of thing is whether they're logical possibilities or not. Moving a big desk, moving a mountain, creating the world, turning water into wine are all logically possible or logically coherent actions. They don't involve a contradiction. Whereas logically impossible things are things like lamp dog ponying, slithy toes gyring and gimbling in the wabe, making square circles, making married bachelors. These things either are meaningless or are contradictory. And eliminating all evils without also eliminating the higher order goods also seems, according to the theist, to fall into that category. Now, where does this leave us? Well, the theist is going to say omnipotence is the ability to do anything, and if we're being maximally clear, what we should say is that that omnipotence is the ability to do anything that is logically possible. When we now return to 9.1, we have what we need if we're trying to understand the theist's response to Mackey's omnipotence defense, to understand why the theist rejects the claim that an omnipotent being can eliminate every evil without doing further damage. If the theist just said, well, I guess, an omnipotent being can't do certain things, that would be a bad way to reject 9.1. Typically, though, the theist will say, listen, an omnipotent being can do anything that is logically possible to be done. Is it the case that eliminating every evil without doing further damage is a logically possible thing? Well, no, because there are higher order goods. There is such a thing as courage. There is such a thing as virtue. There is such a thing as generosity. And there is such a thing as free will. We look around and we see it. So the only way that God could possibly get rid of all the evils is by taking out all those goods too, because those goods by definition require the existence of certain evils. As a result, even though it's not obvious on the surface, the theist will claim, the idea of eliminating all evil without doing further damage to the world is an incoherent concept. It's akin to lamp dog ponying or making 2 and 2 5. And so God's inability to do that doesn't count against God's omnipotence. Doesn't mean that God is less than fully powerful, because it's not even a thing. So the theist then says 9.1 is the flaw in Mackey's omnipotence defense. There are a lot of moves there that I invite you to consider further. I'm not totally convinced that response works. I think it's the kind of, these days, at this point, the traditional response to the appeal to omnipotence in defense of the ninth step of the what's sometimes called evidential argument from evil. There are some more questions for you to consider, though. Number one, if we look back to step 9 of the revised argument from evil, the failure of Mackey's omnipotence defense, that is, if it does fail, doesn't mean that step 9 is false. What it means is that the atheist needs a stronger or more bulletproof defense of the claim that there's evil that can be eliminated without doing further damage, and that appealing to omnipotence may not do the trick for them. I invite you to think about how else an atheist might defend that premise if it's not going to be in Mackey's way. Here's some other things for you to think about as you leave this topic. One is something like this. Is the theist really right that it's logically impossible for a creature to possess free will and yet to never choose to do evil? This is an important part of the theist's response to the argument from evil, that necessarily freedom, if it's true freedom, involves sometimes doing the wrong thing. But the question is, can you imagine a world of truly free creatures who always choose to do good to one another? Or is that just another way of describing a world of unfree beings? Here's another question. Are higher order goods, up to and including free will, are they really worth it? It's one thing to say that there are certain goods that logically require the existence of certain evils. It's a further step to say that those goods are so good as to be worth the horrors of the evils. Something like the Holocaust, when you look at it, in the face, so to speak, the horror is so great that it makes you wonder whether any amount of free will could ever justify allowing something like that to occur. That's another big question between the theist and the atheist. Finally, I think another thing for you to think about, and another point of controversy between the theist and the atheist as we leave this topic is, we often in particular cases can't tell whether or not there is anything that could possibly justify a good God in allowing that evil to occur. Sometimes we just can't see what the higher order goods are that could justify it. We're like, I don't see any around here that could justify allowing this evil to occur. When, if ever, are we rationally entitled to conclude from that ignorance that there are no good justifying reasons, that there are no higher order goods around to justify, or that the goods aren't good enough? A theist is usually going to have to lean really heavily on the fact that, or on the claim that, we shouldn't necessarily expect to know all of the details of why there would be certain evils if God existed. We should, on the contrary, expect that if there were a God, some of those details would be unknowable to us. And I think the atheist is right to push back there and say, um, why is that? I mean, especially if we think of the model of the theistic God as something like a loving parent. When, if ever, is a loving parent not just justified in allowing their child to suffer some evil, but also furthermore justified in refusing to tell the child why they're letting that evil happen to them? That I think is another thing for you to think about, and another place where the theist and the atheist will disagree.